Thank you very much for being here. I am so excited to be at this conference. I've really actually wanted to come to this conference for a really long time. Shannon mentioned that I haven't been, and so I was reluctant to accept an invitation to speak because I felt like I didn't really know the vibe. I didn't really know the people. I didn't really, hadn't attended. I hadn't gotten a sense of all of this, but I'm super honored to be here with a room full of people who understand the materials that we build with are more than just components of structure. They represent stories, they're about labor, they're about environmental histories, and that they're opportunities for whole communities to define their own futures. And we're really in the midst of a reckoning right now about sustainability, equity, climate action, and really how we live in this place. So material and building reuse, I think, right at the intersection of that, of all those concerns. And what really, where that lives for me is in how we are talking to people about it and who we're engaging in those conversations. Because we really have to get better, I think, about telling those stories, about telling the stories of what is possible, not just for the planet, but for the people. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about communication, that's what I do, and how we communicate the value of material reuse by connecting reuse to those things, to jobs, to health, to culture, and to the thriving of people and their families. Because when we do that, reuse becomes not just a sustainability strategy, but a movement within a movement. And in fact, of course, it already is. That's what you are. You are that movement within a movement, and that's why you're here. And now I think we're at, as Shannon alluded to, this critical moment where we can really take an opportunity to grow and scale this. And as I said, I'm new to the conference, so in order to help me a little bit, I hope you'll do me the honor of, if we could see, I want to see a show of hands. I'm trying to get a sense of who's in the room, and so I'd ask you to raise your hand to identify with your role or your sector. And it's absolutely fine to raise your hand more than once because the Venn diagram of this room is probably very overlapped. So let's start with contractors. Contractors in the room, excellent. Developers and owners, those. State and city government folks or municipality types, excellent, excellent. Thank you. Material organization folks. Awesome. Historic preservation people. Excellent. Architects and engineers. Also could be historic preservation, Venn diagram crossing. Thank you. Students. Excellent. I love having some students in the room. So thank you for that. Thank you for humoring me that a little bit there. I'm going to give you some background about me. Like I said, this is might be a little bit more background than you would be expecting, but because I'm not a part of your community, I felt like I should introduce myself a little bit more deeply. And I do hope that we can talk in the next couple of days a little better. Second. That one instead of, sorry, my apologies. Okay, so my roots are actually in the Midwest. While I was born in Tennessee, in Knoxville, and while my father was working at the Tennessee Valley Authority in 1968, my family put down roots in Lawrence, Kansas in the early 70s. And my father is an architect. My mother was an artist and an interior designer. And I grew up in a house that was built in 1910. That's my house on the upper left. And that's the interior. They renovated it. Very contemporary interior in this old building. And we had the first solar array in the community. And they raised us, my sister and I, in this renovated house, and which all of my dad's architecture students worked on. It was a very big, long, project. And of course, all the solar systems failed, as you would expect. I mean, you know, it was a test bed situation. What can I say? I didn't really understand a lot of that at the time, but later I felt like it was this sort of backdrop in, you know, as I was learning more about this. But I attended the University of Kansas, right up the hill from my neighborhood. I started in architecture, but only lasted one semester because I really was trying to figure out how to double major in journalism and architecture, and that was nearly impossible. Plus, I had babysat for all the architecture professors, and that was like a little too close for comfort. It's not awesome. But it was. I left undergrad with journalism and English degrees and a really strong, pervading interest in the built environment and design at all scales. And I've spent my career in the architecture and construction real estate sector. But as Shannon mentioned, I am none of those things. I am a writer and a strategist and a convener. But I've always been sort of a part of this community. Sorry, folks. I'll get it eventually. Deep breaths. There we go. My apologies. So I spent the 1990s in New York City working in magazines, mostly shelter publications, and eventually at Metropolis magazine for a few years. I was also studying for my master's degree at Parsons, and it was actually at Parsons, the new school, where I really had my mind opened to sustainability in a number of ways that I can go on longer about. But one of the most important things, formative things that happened for me at that time was that some sort of pioneering firms were doing some really interesting work in the city and were extremely generous with me in terms of sharing not only what they were doing, but how they were talking about it. One in particular that really sticks in my mind was Randy Croxton and Kirsten Childs were working on the Audubon House restoration. And they toured me through when it was under construction. And we talked so much about all the different things they were doing and what they were retaining and why, and the human health issues, all the stuff. And it was quite impactful. It was part of my thesis project. And they were just so generous about not, like I said, not just sharing, this is what we're doing, this is the project, but like, this is why we talk about it this way, and trying to really express and convey what was happening there and why it was important and why it had these multiple benefits to it, rather than this is just an architecture project, or we're not just saving a building, it's not just a preservation project. It had these other benefits to it. After leaving Metropolis, I joined my father's architecture firm, which is Gould Evans. It became Multi-Studio, that's what it's known by now. And I led communications for them and helped establish their green team, lots of the typical things that were happening in the late 90s. I was already a remote employee in 1998, so kind of an early adopter of that approach, as it were. And then I spent the next 7 years in Boston. It was a very formative time for me in my career and also in my life. I got married, bought my first apartment and renovated it. It was the 3rd floor of this building at the corner of Dartmouth and Tremont. And if you've ever been to Boston, you know that is a very, we call it chaos corner, very busy corner. But Boston was an amazing place to be. The green community there was absolutely, it was like grad school part 2 for me. I mean, what people were doing and trying was really dynamic and interesting and really covering all realms of things. So I learned a lot. And during that time period, I also became chair of the AIA Committee on the Environment, and I started working on a book, Women in Green, Voices of Sustainable Design, which I will talk a little bit more about in a minute. In 2007, I started working with William McDonough and Partners, also still remote, partly because I was deeply inspired by the premise of cradle to cradle and circularity, like so many people. The idea to me that we have these 2 nutrient streams, biological and technical, and the notion that waste could become obsolete was just so potent and powerful. And I was also still in the thrall of the Stuart Brand book, How Buildings Learn, which I admit I'm still in the thrall of that book. I had read it in graduate school, and it was a really big part of the ethos at Bill's studio. So that was really part of my interest there. And in 2008, my husband and I moved to the Bay Area, and we settled in Oakland. And I was still working for McDonough for several years. He had a San Francisco office. And then in 2016, I started my own consulting business, which I am still running today. I restarted my writing and became a senior fellow with Architecture 2030. My sweet spot is really storytelling for built environment teams that are working towards a regenerative future. My clients are built environment professionals, architecture firms, nonprofits. Those are actually a Venn diagram of themselves. They cross quite a bit. And I've worked with contractors and developers as well. And I work on message, story strategy, positioning, thought leadership, that kind of thing. And also helping getting stories published, which is an important part of what we do. And I feel like we really need to, do that better. I mean, the state of the media is a whole different topic, but we have to do a better job, actually, of getting the stories, the nuanced stories out there. So a couple of years ago, facing some tricky school situations and choices in the Bay Area, we made a family decision to make a big move back to the Midwest. So now I'm living in the Kansas City metro region, and not too far from where I started, which has been a really exciting change, but also slightly daunting one. I'm sort of trying to reintegrate with a new community around green, and I'm so excited about what's happening in the Kansas City area. Just to go into the book a little bit, in 2005, I was having some conversations with Jason McLennan, who's an architect. I had met him through BNIM in Kansas City many years before, and he was at that time leading Living Future. And we were talking about how the sustainable design movement seemed to be much more gender diverse than the AEC world in general. And so he invited me to explore that in a book for Ecotone, which was the publishing arm of Living Future. And I invited my friend Lance Hosey to join me in this exploration, and we started asking these questions. What does it mean that female leadership was so central in sustainable design? And what was the connection between sustainability and diversity? And we read a lot of Jane Jacobs. We read a lot of Rachel Carson, and we started talking to as many people as we could. And upon reflection, I think we made both a brilliant and crazy choice, because we would do these interviews, and then we would ask people at the end of an interview, who else should we talk to? And they would tell us 5 or 10 names of people. And then we would be like, oh, we have to talk to those other 5 or 10 people. It just started spiraling out of control. But it was infectious. It was really a fantastic project. And we started asking all of these questions, big questions about really what was the movement addressing? How is it tackling and unpacking all these various topics? And so we decided to organize the book around these big questions, and we had group conversations, and the transcripts of those are really the chapters of the book. It was a fantastic project and an incredible gift. It's actually something that comes up a lot when I mentor, and I do a lot of that now. People are always asking me how to decide about how much volunteer things to do. I am a terrible person to ask this question because I've spent so much time in my career working with the Committee on the Environment, which is all volunteer, and then doing things like books, which are essentially, if anyone tells you a book is not a volunteer activity, tell them they are wrong. But it was the most amazing thing I've done in my career. So I would never want to not have done it, but it's one of those things that, anyway, it was a great experience, and I feel very lucky to have had it. So when the book came out in 2007, we started talking at a lot of different conferences and events, and we realized we had just sort of put something into a form, and it was a conversation that was already happening. It was sort of wanting to happen all over the country. People were like super excited to chime in and, oh, I've been thinking about this. We've been talking about this in my office. It just sort of blossomed, and we were like, oh, we just sort of slipped into something that was already like a discussion. And I'm happy to say that 18 years later, there's one way that this conversation is sort of still continuing, and that is through the podcast, which is called Design the Future. Lindsay Baker and I started this podcast we started in February 2020. This was not a pandemic project. It was before the pandemic, and of course it kind of became, I'm not sure I could really even listen to the first year. Might be a little triggering for me, but it was a great opportunity to have these conversations, especially during that couple of years where we were really missing the in real life interactions. And we interview all these women who are working in various parts of the field. They are all sorts of folks. And we try to keep it really broad. We try not to be too narrow about, probably true, we have an abundance of architects, but we do try to spread it around a lot. We've had several folks from this community, such as Amanda Kaminsky and Frances Yang and Stephanie Phillips and others. In fact, I was planning to quote several of them from the podcast, and then I realized you guys know those people better than I do, so that would be a little awkward. But we recently recorded our 115th episode, and it's a really fun project. It's a great time. But moving on, so that's plenty of background about me. I want to talk about how we talk about this stuff. As you know, material reuse is really about memory. It's about every reclaimed brick, every beam, every board. It carries traces of human and environmental interaction. These materials are part of the cultural fabric, especially in communities that have experienced disinvestment, erasure, displacement, and other issues. This has always been true, of course, but the meaning and value of this seems to increase in importance as culture becomes more and more digital and more ephemeral. And as we reckon with the environmental challenges of our time and all the social challenges that are a part of that. When we reuse materials, we are not just preserving embodied carbon. We are preserving embodied memory. Reuse tells stories, and it honors the work of past generations, and it speaks about the possibility of the future. That has a powerful resonance, especially in neighborhoods where community is under threat. So when we talk about reuse, let's not reduce it to tonnage calculation. It's very tempting and very exciting sometimes to talk about those numbers, but let's elevate it to a cultural practice. That means integrating artists, historians, and local voices into reuse projects. It means documenting and sharing the origin stories of materials. It means designing with visibility and really letting reused materials show their age, their wear, and their story. I think that people increasingly want this. I'm sure you all have stories about this too. They want quality materials with patina and history, especially because the throwaway culture has become so materially unsatisfying. There are traces of this everywhere. The right to repair movement is very exciting, and it's just one signal. People know that new materials are often shoddy at best. They want better. And part of this is making a cultural shift. We're connecting the dots between material reuse and workforce development. The reuse economy is hands-on. This is what I'm so excited about and really excited to learn more about in the next couple of days. It's tactile. It requires labor from deconstruction to remilling, to resale, to redesign, and it presents a profound opportunity for workforce development, especially in communities that have been excluded from some of the traditional green economy pathways. There are many aspects of the broader sustainability movement that have positive job implications. Perhaps none is so clear and so demonstrable as the materials ecosystem. It and you are the physical side of the equation, which means that you're inherently more connected to the person power needed to make it work. This is the social part of sustainability. Materials can be an economic engine for communities. There are still gaps, of course, and I know that's one thing that we're here this week to talk about. But connecting supply, processing, and demand. But these are shrinking, and we can build relationships to advance that process more quickly. Investing in reuse means investing in people. It means creating jobs in logistics, skilled trades, and with local workforce agencies, trade schools, and unions. And it means thinking about reuse not just as an environmental benefit, but as an economic engine. So when we talk about reuse, let's always talk about jobs and people. Let's put real faces to the work, and let's use storytelling to connect these jobs to dignity, pride, and legacy. Let's also talk about health. This is another equalizer. Everyone wants to be healthy, and for their family to be healthy. They want to be able to thrive. Because the materials we use or reuse have deep impacts on community health. In many cases, reuse helps divert toxic waste from landfills or incinerators, protecting air and water quality in frontline communities. It also reduces the need for virgin extraction, which is often linked to pollution and environmental degradation. But more than that, material reuse can be part of a healing process. Designing with reused materials can transform trauma into pride. A school built with brick salvaged from an old community center, a clinic that honors the wood from a historic tree felled by a storm. These are more than just design moves. They're gestures of community healing. Let's communicate these stories and elevate them, because health is not just about air and water, it's also about belonging, safety, and beauty. And I think we can see this, like in the examples. I'm sure many of you have experienced a version of this. One of my clients, VMDO Architects in Charlottesville, they did a community center, and it was on a park right by a forest, and they were going to have to take down a few trees. And so during the community engagement process, there was a lot of discussion about how many trees they could afford to take down, in terms of, the community loved this place, but really wanted this new center. And they ended up finding a way to remill some of that lumber on site in order to reuse it in the building. And now it is a part of some benches and some floors. And I think that's like a very good example of something that came out of the love the community had for this place that turned into a reuse strategy. Those are the kinds of things that we can really lift up for people and make it more clear about what we're talking about. I'm going to talk about a few quick examples, just of things that have inspired me lately. Some of them I'm sure you're well aware of. Like many of you, I'm very inspired by some of the things that are happening outside the US as they embrace new material reuse options. Barbara Buser in Basel, Switzerland has spent 30 years working on systems to reclaim and reuse building components. And they're really changing the rules of the construction system in that municipality. She's very politically engaged and business-minded, and engaging all sorts of workforce strategies. This one, the K118 project, you guys probably have heard of it. It was a Wholesome Award for Sustainable Construction winner. They added 3 floors to an industrial building using 70% reclaimed materials and cutting potential embodied carbon emissions by an estimated 2/3. This is a really different kind of example. One of my clients is David Baker Architects. They have offices in Birmingham, Alabama, and in the Bay Area. And this is an adaptive reuse of a small nondescript warehouse building into offices for a construction firm, Wyatt Builds. And I wanted to bring this up simply because, so the client, the construction firm, had a big pile of polygon, and they were like, we don't want to just dump this in the landfill, figure out a way to make it a part of the project. And it became a design driver. And I just love that, because it's sort of it's the very rudimentary version of reuse. It's like, we have it, don't waste it, let's use it. And it became a big part of the project, which I think is really fantastic. There's another project that recently came to my attention and is very close to where I'm living now. This is in Topeka, Kansas, a state office building called Doffing. It was intended to be reused. That's the original building you can see down there. It was built in the mid-50s, and there was a long design process to renovate the building, reuse it as an office building. And a lawmaker had a moment where they just decided, nope, we're going to tear it down and rebuild it. But fortunately, the two levels, the two subgrade levels, are the central utility plant for the whole area. So they would have to remain occupied and during demolition, which of course opened up a tremendous opportunity so they ended up having to decide, they basically dismantled the whole building from the top, piece by piece, and were able to rescue an amazing amount of materials, like incredible materials, valuable materials, limestone, granite, greenstone, glass, all the things. It was quite a process. It was probably only possible because the deputy secretary of, I think he's the facilities guy also, was a big fan of doing this and really wanted to not waste all of this. And he had also wanted to renovate the building. But they were able to reuse quite a number of things. It's going to be a really great model to look at, partly because many of the contractors that were involved, the subs, they had never been involved in that before. And so a lot of things happened on site. Of course, there's a great carbon story behind it as well. But that is certainly not why the very Republican Kansas legislature decided to do it. But it's a great example of how something can have these other benefits. And I think at the end of the day, it will be fascinating to see how the cost. I mean, they did spend time and about $12 million demoing it with that approach. But the amount of really quality materials that they got out of it, I'll be very interested to see how that plays out. So all of that, I want to talk a little bit about how we talk about all these things. And when I'm talking about that, I mean circularity, reuse, workforce memory, health in a way that resonates, and especially that resonates outside of our community. This is one thing it's something that's been on my mind for a long time, perhaps a little bit more so recently. I've been really acutely aware, I mean, I'm sure as everyone, but in this political environment, I feel like lots of industries, lots of sub-industries, and lots of communities tend to be in a bit of a bubble. And we don't do a great job about talking to people that are outside of that bubble. So that is something, that is sort of the macro piece that I think about a lot. And I want to propose that we really shift the narrative from waste management to resource storytelling, and we stop leading with guilt and start leading with possibility. Celebrate creativity, use plain language, and invite diverse messengers, community leaders, artists, youth, elders, to speak to the value of reuse from their own vantage point. This way, if we can root our messages in place, the story about, of course, a story about reclaimed timber in Vermont is a different story than about salvaged brick in Oakland, but it will make much more sense to the people that are there if they understand that it connects to the history of their own place. This relates to policy, partnerships, public imagination, all the things that we'll be talking about this week, and things that I'm excited to learn more about from you. We can't scale it without those things. So we need to connect our communication to this kind of systems change. And that means communicating the co-benefits of reuse, carbon reduction, job creation, waste diversion, cultural preservation in ways that speak to different audiences. In today's landscape, communication about sustainability as a broad topic is often very hampered, as you know, by political polarization. We have to be the ones to overcome this, and not just by fighting back against stories that we think are wrong, but by telling the stories that we know are true. We have to focus on storytelling that focuses on shared human values, on tangible improvements to daily life, by emphasizing the ways that reuse creates more jobs, better health outcomes, and higher quality of life for all. It means working with city governments to build reuse mandates, with philanthropy to fund pilot programs, and with media to tell better stories. It also means making reuse really visible. Let's celebrate buildings and infrastructure that use salvaged materials. Let's give them awards. Let's put up plaques. Let's make reuse aspirational, not marginal. Because the more we show the beauty, value, and impact of reuse, the more we expand the public imagination. We shift what people think is possible. So I'm going to talk about 4 steps that these are sort of the 4 things I like to discuss with clients and others about ways to engage more powerfully. First, to raise our voices persuasively, I think we have to activate, we have to really listen deeply. We really have to do more of that. Listening is, this is something that, especially in the architectural world, I think every architectural firm I've ever worked with, including my father's, all thought they were better listeners than everybody else. But it's actually, listening, I think, is a skill that we're never taught. Most of us don't practice it. And it's really something we need to think more intentionally about and really work on, especially in such a shouty world, actually. The first chapter of my book was really about listening, listening to the land and to people, because it lets us discover the whole living system and really understand where our work fits into that. It's the key to bringing people into the process of the built environment in a meaningful way, and which would include never ever calling them users, by the way. One of my big pet peeves, I'm sure we all have them. It's crucial because as technical as this pursuit is, it requires love and learning new ways of being. Bill Reed, an architect and regenerative systems thinker, I'm sure many of you have read or heard of him. He says that we should be asking not what can we do, but who do we need to be in order to be more regenerative thinking. Thank you. The table is large and the conversation includes cultural heritage, climate science, public health. Together we can shift the system. We can help owners and communities be part of the cultural shift that will benefit our next generation, but this depends on translating material health and equity measures into terms that make sense for all these other audiences. This is about building a value frame. Because too often we're trying to convince clients and communities of the need for these solutions rather than just revealing their value and benefits. The value frame is the story. That's all. It's just a simple story about the material system and the design that includes health and climate and justice. It's a story that includes them and their points of view. It is important to think carefully about the people that we're interacting with, clients, collaborators, policymakers, and the public. The value benefits frame can work for all of those audiences if we link outcomes to what people care about most. And I'm not just talking about framing everything around ROI, although that can be important depending on your audience, but it's really about understanding the implications of any given project on its owner and the full community. There was a study by this organization called Potential Energy, and it was with the Yale Climate Change Communications folks. And they were looking at how climate messages were being received and how they resonated with the public. And not surprisingly, they found that alarm is polarizing and concern is universal. What people care about most is that their kids and future generations will have an opportunity to thrive. And that leads really to the idea of design for the possible. This concept is often called possibilism, which is a terrible, terrible word. It is worse than sustainability, and that's saying a lot, seriously. But the idea of it is, I mean, it's really what we're doing every day, is showing what is possible and trying to invite people into it. The idea keeps sliding back into my consciousness. It's referenced in 3 of the best nonfiction books I've read in recent years: Donut Economics, Flourish, and Not the End of the World. And it's a really powerful thing. I believe that, you know, demonstrating the possible is really the crux of what many people in this room are doing on a day-to-day basis. Conveying the possible, it's key to inviting people in. On the podcast, Lindsay and I once spoke with Janice Barnes, who's a resilience professional, and she shared her guiding question with client groups, which is, how might we? Which I just love because it's very simple. It's like it invokes process, possibility, and the collective. And I think that really gets to the bigger issue, which is my third thing, really talk like a human. And talk like a human, this is not even my concept. This is Potential Energy actually has a PDF about this. Their Potential Energy is focused on communicating with people about climate more broadly, not about building reuse or material reuse. But if anybody's interested, I can certainly send it to you. But it's really important that we remember that language matters. We cannot be using all the jargon because it doesn't, it sets up barriers, and it also does not, people, they just blank out. When you start talking, I mean, when you lead with, embodied carbon, people are like, what are you talking about? And I've tried. I have a hat that says, ask me about embodied carbon. I wear it to baseball games all the time. I have a teenager. But it's not, those terms are not getting us there. That's not the thing. I mean, they're very useful for us because, of course, distinguishing between operational and embodied is a very important topic, but it's not helpful for bringing in the everybody else. And we need everybody. We really do. And we need to be, because they are hearing stories from other places. And we need to make sure that they're hearing our stories too. It's a little bit like, I think it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg who said that we should lead in a way that invites people to join us. And that's what this is really about. Because of course the words we use, there's so many of them, and so many of them, like there's jargon in every field and every subfield and every subsector. In ours, even within the bubble, there's not agreement about what most of these words mean. And that's not super helpful. I mean, like some of it is fine, it's nascent, we're trying to work through it, but it's a problem. I mean, even the term, if you think about it, existing buildings, like that's an architecture term that no normal human on the street would say existing building. They're like, what do you mean? As opposed to what? I mean, we really have to be more, I think we have to be more careful about how, and I'm not, again, it sounds like I'm saying, oh, let's dumb it down. That's not it at all. I really do think we have to be, we have to interrogate our terms and make sure that if we're going to use circularity, there's a good one, with community members, that's not at the tip of their tongue. So you have to have at least have a conversation with them about the what and the why behind that term. And that itself can be a really dynamic, fun conversation. But at the end of it, if they're not buying in, you got to move on from that word. And that relates to this topic. So in order to be persuasive, we have to be absolutely clear with our words and root things in facts. You guys might know the late Swedish doctor Hans Rosling. He wrote this amazing book called Factfulness. And he details all these sort of tendencies of human behavior that relate to communication. And this is the one that really struck me. This is one of the human impulses that get in the way of deep fact-based understanding. So from all the facts in the world, our attention filter selects the most dramatic. And this dramatic attention filter makes the world look more dramatic than it is. And of course, he wrote that book in like 2017. And if you think about that concept as it relates to social media, it's even worse, right? So this is part of the communications ecosystem that we have to contend with and accept. It's like part of the frame condition now. So I think that, I think it's a big problem. I think we have to ditch the hyperbole. I honestly do. And I have a few words that I'm hoping people will use less. I don't know if I'll have any impact with this, but there's 3 that I'm really on a campaign to get people to stop using. Existential, totally overused, almost always incorrectly, means very little, telegraphs panic. Like, what is the point of that? Like, people are frozen and nervous if they believe it, or they're dismissive because they don't. Like, there's no path of action that results from that word, typically. Let's see, the other 2, crisis and emergency, not a big fan. I know it is a crisis, and I also know it's an emergency, but I don't think using those words is getting us to action. I just don't. I don't think it's spurring people to do something. And in some cases, I think it's inuring people to the actual problems. And a lot of this, Jeff, it's sort of clickbait for the choir, and then everybody else just tunes out. And that's exactly what we don't need right now, in my opinion. So we have to define terms, and it can be a fun exercise to have with collaborators, with communities, with others. And language clarity will really free you to unleash your superpower and show what is possible and really design and materialize the future. To create systems-based solutions embedded with material health and equity benefits, and the potential to thrive together. Because we can make things better. In fact, you are right now, by being here, by sharing, by doing what you do every day. And we can do this by moving forward together and not wasting energy on disagreements and leaving room for those pulling in the other direction. I'm going to recap those. Listen deeply to the entire system. Outcomes will have multiple benefits, value, and potential across the system. Build a value frame with evidence and terms authentic to your stakeholders. Talk like a human, just good practice. Define your terms. And then design and materialize the future. This is a little, you feel like trying to put that in practice. This is a step you could take right away. Identify one thing, like an element of a project that you're working on right now, that you could reframe in value terms. And then try to investigate that topic with your team, especially the bits that seem like firmly accepted fact. Then define any word whose meaning is not commonly understood, and then diagram and narrate the challenge with stakeholders if possible, depending on the problem or the project that you chose. And once you create that story, I hope you'll share it, share what you learn with me and with others. I recently, I did present this little sort of assignment at Living Future in 2024. And about a year later, I heard back from someone who tried it. And I was so gratified because they had had a very unsatisfying experience with a client where they presented sustainability strategies and gotten quite a cool response. And they went back and rethought it all and basically reframed it in their language. And the people they presented to were so pleased with it that they invited them to the board and then hired them. So I was very happy to hear that it actually worked. I think you might be the only person who took my recommendation, but that's okay. One is better than none. As you know, reuse at any scale is not just about materials. It's about meaning, and meaning is what moves people. That's why you and this subset of the sustainability movement has such a tremendous opportunity in what you're actually doing and in what you can communicate about it. Because when people understand the full value of reuse, not just the carbon, but the culture, they'll care more and they'll speak up. And we need them to do that. We need them to join us, and we need them to go to meetings and say yes to things. I was at a Kansas City climate action meeting about 6 months ago, and one of the things that all the elected officials, people kept asking the elected officials there, what do you need from us? And they're like, come to the meetings, please. All the no people come. We need the yes people. You know, this room is filled with citizens and designers and all these people that are super pro climate action. And all the elected officials are like if 10% of you would have come to this meeting the other day, we would have gotten a yes on this project. You know, we need that group of people in the conversation. This is a book I'm reading right now called Multi-Solving. It came to my attention through a tweet by the author years ago. Her work did, and she's really she studied with Dana Meadows, so she's very systems thinking oriented person. But I'm very taken with it right now because it seems like such a maybe deceptively simple idea, but it's really about using one investment of time, money, or energy to address multiple problems, which of course is something that, you know, municipal teams are always looking to do. That's a very efficient and cost-effective way to do things on the city scale. And I feel like so many things about what you guys are doing fits into this idea. But I wanted to read you her tweet because it reminded me of the other kinds of stories that are out there and what we're sort of up against with that, and why it's so important that we tell our stories better and more often. She wrote, "It is some very effective marketing that has convinced so many of us that getting off fossil fuels is a sacrifice as opposed to a money-saving, peace-promoting, water-protecting, health-improving technological leap forward." And she's right. I mean, there's this whole narrative about how all things green are bad, and I mean, it's quite unbelievable. And we do not need to waste time refuting that stuff. Please don't go on Truth Social and try to argue with those people. Not a great plan. But we do need to show what is actually possible and happening, because that is what will tamp down those other stories right there. I wanted to say real quickly, and I will wrap up, I'm probably over time, a little thing about agency. I think built environment professionals have amazing power, especially collectively, and that we don't do an awesome job of always tapping into that. But part of our strength is our networks. One of those networks is right here in this room right now. And we really need everybody in this. We need to lean on each other, find out what's working in your community, find out what worked to bring more lay people into the conversation when you needed to get something passed at the civic scale. And there's also an issue about making sure that we're bringing in other people. And this speaks to my point earlier about not becoming a bubble, right? Or staying in your bubble. And it's not, I mean, that impulse is just about, you know, people, we're busy, right? We're trying to get work done. You end up sort of shrinking things down as you get busier and busier. But we had Ifri Escott on the podcast recently, and she made an interesting point about how trickle down from the leading edge will not be enough, and we really need to accelerate at the front end, but also in the middle. And we need to be intentional about who we're bringing into community with us. And she was talking a little bit about the architectural profession, but I think it really applies to the whole movement and how we're bringing in all sorts of other people and not letting this be this fight to make reuse work and make the built environment sustainable is not just about the built environment community. It's really about everybody. One last thing, actually it's the second to last thing. Anat Shenker-Osario, if you've ever heard of this person, she is a political strategist and a messaging consultant. She's really worked on political campaigns. But she has this concept called sell the brownie, not the recipe, which I absolutely love. I wish I thought of it, but I have to just quote her and say it because it's so succinct. It's perfect. Like, and she uses this, she's talking about when you're trying to sell policy, don't talk about all the nitty gritty of the policy, talk about the result. But the same is true for us. We have to, like, it's important to know all the nitty gritty, but we really need to stay focused when we're trying to get people to buy in. Tell them about the delicious outcome. That's what we're really selling here. Like, we need to invite our neighbors. My mental model is think about how I would talk about it with my neighbor who has nothing to do with the built environment whatsoever. They have no stake in it except that they have a house and live in a community and whatever, you know. But like, they would want to hear about the brownie part. They don't care about the recipe. So I love that. I thought you might appreciate the simplicity of that. And last, I want to close with a quote, which awkwardly, I don't actually know who said it. This quote is attributed on the internet to 5 amazing women: Ann Whiston Spurn, Simone Weil, Pamela Mang, Terry Tempest Williams, and Deb Habib. And while it's crazy that I have been unable to confirm its true origin, I love including it because it also makes me think of having all those 5 women in the same room, like for a dinner party. Wouldn't that be so fun? Here's the quote: "Place is a doorway into caring. Love of place unleashes the personal and political will needed to make profound change. It can also unite people across diverse ideological spectra because place is what we all share. It is the common that allows people to call themselves a community." With that, thank you so much, and I really hope to connect with you all in the next couple of days. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions. Shannon, do we have time for questions?
Oh, yes.
And I think there's a mic down there, and there's also a handholder behind you. That's okay.
Can y'all hear me? All right.
It's okay if you don't have questions.
Can you raise hands?
Thank you.
Thanks. I was promised my wife I will ask at least one. So
Way to get it out of the way.
So you mentioned early on the changing media landscape, and we're going to come back around to talk about if you worked about how you, as a communications professional, have to adapt your work.
Yes. Okay. So that's a very long topic. But so there's a couple things. The media landscape, the design and built environment media landscape, just to start with that. The finances are very bad for all those publications. One could see that there are some upsides in that, which is that they all want free content. So, you know, it's just, I mean, they're all holding on by a thread, frankly. I shouldn't really, that's maybe a little dramatic to say it that way, but they're not, they are, many of the publications that used to be more multidisciplinary have shifted over to being interiors focused because that's where the advertisers are. Some of the other, well, environmental building news is, you know, shifted ownership recently, and we'll see where that lands. I think that's still TBD. Just, there's, that business model is poor. It really is. I mean, it was a struggle back when I was at Metropolis in the mid-90s. It was difficult then, and we ended up starting a furniture fair, basically, to, as a revenue source to fund, you know, the magazine. And now you'll notice, I'm sure many of you have noticed, but many magazines, international and design publications in the States, have awards programs, lots and lots of categories, because it's a revenue stream. That's, I mean, I feel for those folks, I really do. That's not a great situation. There are some excellent editors out there. They're looking for these stories. I just got an email recently from an editor at Metropolis. Their winter issue is focused on sustainability, and they're looking for great stories. And I'm like, okay, I have many. Yes, let's do that. So, you know, like it's trying, but it's a shadow of its former self. Let's just say that. Then there's the broader landscape, which is more mainstream media. And that is a different kind of challenge. Again, there's upsides and downsides. I mean, I think it's great that Fast Company covers architecture more than it did 15 years ago. I think it's great that Bloomberg has absorbed, I mean, I liked City Lab by itself, but I'm glad they're still running architecture stories after they absorbed City Lab. So pros and cons. But it's not, and it's not impenetrable. Like I said, I mean, the one good thing for practitioners and folks is that they need content. And if you're willing to package things for them and get them images and good sources, they want it. So try not to be completely fatalistic about the state of the media.
Question in the back.
For Shannon, we should have. Get your steps.
Kira. Thank you. Michael Olata. I'm actually from St. Paul, but I'm a graduate student at university right now. Just going back to your journey of being which are two kind of college towns. Is there any significant in growing up in college towns that impacted in your influence on small towns?
Very interesting question. I mean, I loved growing up in Lawrence. I don't remember Knoxville. In fact, I haven't ever been back. It's on my bucket list right now. But I loved growing up in a college town. I loved the scale of it. As a kid and a teenager, it felt very like I could move around in it in a way that, like, I'm not sure I would have felt that way in a big city. And of course, I was growing up in the context of an architecture firm. So, which, like so many firms, started doing renovation was the roots of the firm. So to me, I just assumed that's what architecture was for the longest time, is that like you just reuse. And there was all these historic buildings on the campus, and that's what they were renovating and things like that. So there's probably a little bit of like sort of DNA in there that way. I don't know if it's really, and I'm my house too. I mean, I thought it was normal to have a house like that. You know how it is when you're a kid and you're like, I'm the center of the universe, and this is like what so looking back, I'm sure I should have appreciated that more while I was in it. But it was, and they adapted it over time. You know, the longer they lived there, they changed things, and you know, that I think that solar water tank is probably still underneath that room. I've been back in the house recently, and I was trying to sort of check it out without asking him about it. But I think so. One of the things that was really funny about that is that when I was in grad school, we were talking about planning questions. This isn't quite where you were going, but they wanted everything divided by small town. I mean, you know, rural and very small town to urban. And I was like, well, I grew up in something that was in the middle. Like I did not like the dichotomy that was being set up there. I did not appreciate that it was such a one or the other. Because I was like, I think a pretty big college town. I mean, Lawrence is, well, when I was growing up, it was more like 50,000. It's probably 120 by now. You know, so it's not a small town. But that was a very funny conversation in my planning classes at Parsons, actually. They were like, nope, it's one of the, pick where, you know, like, because we did a little survey about where people grew up, and I was like, none of the above. They did not appreciate that. So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Do you have any more questions?
Right down here.
Natalie, forgive me. Raise your hand. Sorry, but I'll do a woman question and a new home.
Woo! Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate your focus on manage communications and outreach for a Habitat community affiliate in a small city. I would consider a 50,000 population small city, right in that in between. And I think about the people I talk to about affordable housing, about reuse and our restoring the customers I can reach. And when it comes to plain language and selling reuse, money or cost is the.
Yes.
And so I'm curious how you blend all of these, you know, priorities when so many communities are most driven by the cost and their budget. The story and where it came from is always a nice to have, and
yes.
a beautiful thing you tap into it. But how do you drop or how do you blend it?
Yes. Great question. And I think so. There are plenty of clients and stakeholders that cost will always be the number one, and that's that the whole value frame needs to be built from that, with that as the baseline, 100%. And the way I would suggest working through that is really to make sure that they're comparing costs holistically, which is to say more about value than cost on its face. Because that's actually the problem with all the new stuff, right? Like, yeah, fast fashion is super cheap and you get to wear the sweater twice and then it's falling apart, right? That's the problem. So finding out a way to make that point and make it clear that if they want this thing to be sturdy and durable, depending on its use in the setting that they're going for X number of years, they might have to, like, they want to invest in value and not just look at upfront costs. So I think that's the big key right there. And that can still be hard because they can still be like, I get it, but I just don't have a budget for that. But the problem is that's going to set them up to be in a budget pickle later on, right? And you don't want to put them in that position either. So helping them to understand the cost piece as it relates to just the broader time scale, I think is really the answer to that. But you're absolutely right. The value frame, I mean, we can be all like health and everybody, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, most of the places are like, no, it's just cost. But even like with facility manager, to scale it up to like an institution or a commercial application, they do care about durability and longevity because that will factor into longer term cost. I mean, that kind of depends on who you're talking to and what their, like how long their responsibility lasts, right? Which is another issue of the cost thing. Great question though, and congratulations. That's a 5-week old.